Fantastic to be here at the RSA today and following on from an early childhood education visit that I did this morning to highlight the changes that are coming into effect on the 1st of April, that's tomorrow. We've got significant changes across the board that will affect up to a quarter of New Zealanders in terms of the amount of money that they have to come and go on. We've got extra funding coming in for families with young children, increases to the Best Start payment that will help families with newborn children in the first year of the child's life, and then for some families that support extends to the second and the third year. We're increasing the level of financial support that they are receiving, increasing the family tax credit, again to help those families to get ahead, and significantly increasing access to the childcare subsidy so that a much greater number of families can be supported to have their kids in early childhood education, allowing them to enter the labour force and to work more, which will help to increase their overall household incomes, but also leading to better outcomes for their young children as well. And then here at the RSA, we've been able to talk about the fact that superannuation and the veterans pension are increasing again from tomorrow to support people who rely on that income in order to be able to make ends meet. Significantly, the minimum wage increases tomorrow as well. And again, I know that that's going to make a big difference for some people who work really, really hard for relatively low incomes. That increase to the minimum wage is going to be so vital for them at a time when the cost of living is continuing to increase. And with that, I've got some of my fellow ministers, the Minister for Social Development and Employment here, the Minister for Veterans and our local Member of Parliament here for Manarewa with me as well. I'm happy to open up and take questions.
Prime Minister, on the ACT page, there's been criticism that it hasn't gone far enough and doesn't take into account inflation, so people will actually be worse off in real terms.
At the point that we set the minimum wage, all of the numbers were actually lining up at 7.2%. So the overall salary increase for those who are not on the minimum wage was sitting at 7.2%, and the consumer price index, inflation, was sitting at 7.2%, and we increased the minimum wage by 7.2%. So all of those numbers do line up. Now, and if you take any given day, the numbers will shift around a little bit. So what you have to do is look at it over time. I'm confident that over time, the work that we've been doing to increase the minimum wage is making sure that those people are able to continue to get ahead.
David Seymour says this is the employed people working now having to pay more for people not to work. What do you say to that?
I think David Seymour should come to the RSA or go and visit a retirement village or a rest home and say to those people why he doesn't think that they should get an increase to their incomes because they're not working hard enough.
Did businesses get enough time to adapt to these minimum wage changes?
Yeah, the minimum wage changes were well foreshadowed in advance. I acknowledge that for the small business community in particular, the minimum wage can put an extra cost on them and extra pressure on them. But in my conversations with small business owners, they also want to make sure that they're doing the right thing by their staff as well. They also want their staff to benefit from their hard work too. So, look, I acknowledge that it is something that businesses always face that difficult juggling act when it comes to things like the increase in the minimum wage, but it is the right thing to do.
With a quarter of New Zealand suddenly having more income, are you worried that will fuel inflation?
Ultimately, the increases that we're making keep up with the inflation rate being where it's at. As you'll know, there's a lot of work internationally to try and bring the global rate of inflation down. New Zealand's not immune from the huge global pressure around inflation. But if you look internationally, our inflation rate is actually one of the lower ones. While it's very high by historic standards and we want to get it down, it's actually lower than many of the other countries that we compare ourselves to, including our friends across the Tasman.
Some say the benefits are still short of what has been recommended in the past. Are you letting people on the lowest incomes down?
I think if you look at the increases that we've made to support for people on the lowest incomes in the last 5 years, it is significant. We've put more, we've restored benefits to the level that they were before the mother of all budgets, and I'm very proud of the work that we've done there. We have put a lot of energy and a lot of money into supporting those people who are on those lowest incomes.
On the minimum wage, why not raise it a little bit more to meet the living wage?
The living wage and the minimum wage are two different debates, but ultimately we want people to be able to work hard and get ahead. As a government employer, we've been focused on getting the living wage implemented across the public sector. That's up to each individual employer to do, and as a government, we've been trying to lead by example. So you'll see in a lot of our workforces we've been very successful in getting a living wage as the minimum level of payment for people who are doing some of those vital public service jobs.
National energy policy, have you had a chance to see that? What do you make?
I've only seen some of the headlines around it. It's about time the National Party discovered that electricity and renewable energy actually exists, because up until now they seem to have mounted all of their arguments in favour of continuing the use of fossil fuels. So I think that's a welcome development. New Zealand's got one of the highest uptake rates for electric vehicles in the developed world, and that's because of the policies that we've put in place that have been opposed by the opposition. So I think if they are starting to realise that renewable energy is the way of the future, that's a welcome development. In terms of the policy that they're putting out there around things like incentivising renewable energy and making it easier to get renewable energy consents, that's a big part of the RMA reform program, which again the National Party are now opposing.
Is there too much red tape at the moment in that sector?
One of the reasons that we're reforming the RMA is that there is too much red tape around the whole area of resource consenting. We're streamlining that process significantly, and at the moment the National Party are opposing that work.
Some questions out of Wellington. Can you give a cast iron guarantee staff did not cover up Nash's email?
I think the staff here made a mistake. I have to accept them at their word. I wasn't there at the time that this happened. Both of the people concerned are people who I regard to be incredibly diligent and honest, with high levels of integrity. And so I think it's really horrible that their integrity is being impeached in the way that it is at the moment. Ultimately, the responsibility for signing out Official Information Act requests sits with the minister concerned. They have to be responsible and accountable for what goes out in their name. In this case, that was Stuart Nash, and he ultimately has been held accountable for the release or non-release of that information.
If it rests with the minister, why did it go to the Prime
Minister?
Minister?
Does the timeline not concern you?
This was some time ago that the then Prime Minister's office became aware of that. Ultimately, it would have been nice if they'd remembered it 2 weeks ago, but in reality, they deal with thousands and thousands of pages of information regularly. I don't expect them to memorise every one of them. In this case, I think they made a mistake several years ago. I don't necessarily expect that they would have remembered it, but I do expect that Stuart Nash would have remembered it. So when I asked him about this 2 weeks ago, he should have remembered that. He should have known that that was there, and he should have told me about it. He didn't.
And just final question, will you investigate the wider culture of how staff respond to OIAs?
The work that we've been doing around Official Information Act requests, I think, has been sound and positive. We're proactively releasing a much greater amount of information. We're getting much more timely OIA responses across the public sector. That's not to say that there aren't still areas where we can do better, but if you look at the timeliness of them, responding within the deadlines, the performance of the public service has improved. We have been putting pressure on that. We have been getting more information out there proactively. And also we've been publishing Official Information Act request responses as well, so that everyone can see the information as it flows out, not just the person who requested it. I think all of those things are important for transparency, they're important for the democratic process. We'll keep looking to see if we can do more though. The Official Information Act is 40 odd years old and was created in a world before email and before social media and so on, and so we do have to keep looking and making sure that all of the systems and processes are keeping up with that, and that includes the OIA itself, which I'm sure in due course there'll be an opportunity to look at that.
The Official Information Act is a pretty mundane part of Parliament every day, so why did this have to go to the Prime Minister's office? What was special about this case?
Generally speaking, a lot of Official Information Act requests, Ministers' offices consult with the Prime Minister's office on them, and the Prime Minister's office, to be frank, will sometimes spend more time on a particular OIA request or not, depending on the nature of that request. Clearly in this case, a mistake was made in the Prime Minister's office, but ultimately the accountability for that, the responsibility for that, still sits with the Minister to whom the request was addressed. And in this particular case as well, the accountability for the fact that the information exists in the first place, the fact that that email trail was completely inappropriate and against the guidance of the Cabinet Manual, that accountability sits with Stuart Nash, and he's been held accountable for that.
Do you accept that it looks like there was some sort of discussion to try and avoid releasing that information going on between your office and Stuart Nash's office?
No, I don't accept that. In the choice between a cock-up and a conspiracy, this one was absolutely in the cock-up end. Someone made a mistake. I don't think there was any ill intent there. The people concerned, I know them well, and I regard them as being incredibly honest, diligent and hard-working public servants. And they made a mistake, but every human being makes a mistake from time to time.
Just back on the minimum wage, because this is a debate that comes up every year. Have you looked at any other options for how that is actually set? For example, setting it as a fraction of the living wage?
The minimum wage gets reviewed every year, and so the government of the day, when they review the minimum wage, have the opportunity to look at all of the different things that would go into making a judgment about where the level of the minimum wage can be.
But not specifically setting it to a fraction of the median wage?
But there are a variety of things. So government will consider living wage, they will consider the consumer price index, so the rate of inflation, consider overall wage growth within the economy. All of these things get factored in. So one of the things that we know from looking at, say, superannuation or benefits is when you peg them to one particular measure, sometimes another measure that you might have otherwise considered actually would have given people a bigger increase. Because that was certainly the case this time around, where a number of the financial supports that we have available are pegged to wage growth, whereas actually the CPI, the inflation rate, was higher, and so we decided to increase them by the inflation rate because that was the highest and would therefore give people the best chance to keep up with the rising cost of living. I think the more you nail this down into specific formulas, the more likely you are to get kind of perverse outcomes. So the way the minimum wage works, it's done based on a range of factors, and then ultimately the ministers, who are accountable to the public, make the judgment on what the appropriate level of the minimum wage should be.
Is the plan to keep on increasing it though, year after year after year?
Well, we've increased it every year that we've been in government because we know that people who are living on those lowest incomes actually work really hard, and they deserve the opportunity to benefit from that hard work and to get ahead. So I'm really proud of our track record there.
Is there any fear of what might happen in a recession if employers aren't able to pay these higher wages?
That's a big and complex and hypothetical question. Obviously, our work on the economy is to make sure we keep the economy in as good a shape as possible. We want to acknowledge that it's a difficult global economic environment at the moment, and across the world, many banks, many economists are forecasting the potential for global recessionary conditions. Will we doing everything we can to support New Zealanders through that?
Can I just turn you back to energy? I'm sorry, just
Yes.
some more questions coming through. Do you have any plans for decarbonising sectors like manufacturing or public transport more than they are already? And does that policy out today make you feel pressured to do more in the space of renewable energy?
Well, if you look at the carbon budgets that we've released, decarbonising transport, decarbonising heavy industry are integral to achieving the targets that we've put out there. Ultimately, I think the plans from National today seem to be fairly late to the party and seem fairly light on detail. We've actually been getting on with the job of actually doing it. There's more work to be coming very soon around industrial decarbonisation. We've already got significant work rolling out across the public service to decarbonise the public service. Transport is one of the most complex areas to get into. Reducing transport emissions is challenging given that the vehicle fleet that we've got on the road right now is likely to stay on the road for some time. People don't tend to replace their cars every year. And so even though that we're making a lot of progress on electric vehicles, clearly it is going to be a longer game to make sure that we're reducing our overall carbon emissions from transport.
Some of the families earlier wanted broader criteria around eligibility for the childcare subsidy. Is that something that is open for discussion?
We're always looking at how we can better support families, increasing access to the childcare subsidy today. This is the biggest increase in quite some time, an increase in access to the childcare subsidy. I never rule things out, in terms of how we might continue to expand support in the future. All right. Thanks, everybody. Cheers. Thank you to you guys as well. Thank you for having us. Yeah. Very good.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.